My sister raised her champagne glass in front of 60 guests, looked directly at me, and told the room that she was grateful her fiancé had a real career to build their future on, unlike some people who were still figuring out what they wanted to be at 32. Everyone laughed. Her fiancé laughed hardest of all, since he happened to work at the exact company he assumed I couldn't even get an interview at. What none of them knew, standing in that rented ballroom with champagne in their hands, was that I owned it. All of it. Including his job. I didn't say anything that night. I smiled. I let the joke land. I let 60 guests believe exactly what my sister wanted them to believe about me. But 3 weeks later, when her fiancé's name showed up on a routine compliance report crossing my desk, tied to something serious enough that I couldn't have looked the other way, even if I'd wanted to, I finally understood that the quietest revenge I'd ever get wasn't going to come from a speech. It was going to come from doing my job. Welcome back to Hidden Truth Stories. This is the channel for the moments a family finally learns exactly who they've been underestimating, and what happens when the truth comes out on someone else's terms entirely. If a story like this feels familiar, drop a comment and let me know. And before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Type your city below. I read every single one. My name is Simone Ashford. I'm 32, and for the last 4 years, I've run a mid-sized logistics and freight brokerage company under a holding entity called Meridian Group, a name almost nobody outside my board and my closest executives has ever connected to me personally. I built it deliberately that way, not out of shame, but out of a hard-earned instinct that comes from growing up the daughter my family never quite knew what to do with. My younger sister Whitney is 29, and she has always occupied a very specific, very comfortable place in our family's imagination. The daughter who did things the normal way, the recognizable way, the way our parents could explain easily at dinner parties. She went to a well-known university, took an entry-level marketing job at a growing logistics company right out of school, and climbed steadily, visibly, in a manner our whole family could track and celebrate in real time. I took a different, messier path. I dropped out of a traditional MBA program 2 years in, over my parents' loud objections, to take a controlling stake in a struggling regional freight company that a former professor of mine was trying to offload before it collapsed entirely. I spent those first 2 years doing almost every job in that company myself. Dispatch, accounts receivable, driving a route personally more than once when we were short-staffed. Restructuring it from something barely surviving into something genuinely profitable. Then quietly acquiring 2 smaller competitors and folding the whole operation under Meridian Group. A name I chose specifically because it revealed nothing about who was actually running it. My family, for most of those 4 years, believed I worked in operations, logistics stuff, a phrase vague enough that nobody ever asked a real follow-up question, largely because nobody in my family had ever shown much curiosity about anything I did that didn't come with an easily explainable title attached. My mother introduced me at gatherings as someone who does something with trucking companies, always with a faint, apologetic edge to her voice, as though the imprecision of it reflected some deficiency in me, rather than simply being the truth I'd chosen not to correct. Whitney's fiancé, Trent, joined the marketing team at the freight brokerage 2 years ago, the same company I now owned entirely through Meridian, though he had absolutely no idea of that fact, since his hiring, like almost everyone's below the senior leadership tier, had happened entirely through normal channels, with my name appearing nowhere on the paperwork he'd have ever seen. If your family ever built an entire narrative about your life based on a title they could easily understand, while missing the actual truth entirely, tell me in the comments, what did they get wrong? The engagement party happened on a Saturday evening in early spring, in a rented ballroom my parents had spent considerably more on than I suspect they'd ever admit out loud. I came alone, the way I usually did to these things, and spent most of the evening in the comfortable, practiced role I'd occupied at family events for years. Pleasant, unremarkable, deliberately vague whenever anyone asked what I'd been up to. Whitney's toast came around 9, after 2 glasses of champagne had loosened the room considerably. She thanked our parents, thanked Trent's family, and then, almost as an aside, delivered exactly the line I opened this story with, looking directly at me while she said it, smiling in a way that made absolutely clear the comment wasn't accidental. "I'm just so grateful," she said, "that I found someone with a real career to build a future with. Not everyone gets that lucky at 32. The room laughed. My mother laughed. Trent laughed hardest, raising his glass toward the room with the easy confidence of a man who genuinely believed himself to be, in every measurable way, the more accomplished one standing in that ballroom. I want to be honest about what that moment actually felt like, because it wasn't the dramatic gut punch you might expect from hearing it secondhand. It was smaller and stranger than that. A kind of quiet, almost clinical recognition that my family had constructed an entire understanding of my worth based on nothing, on a vague phrase about operations, logistics stuff, that none of them had ever bothered to investigate further, and that Whitney had just used that vacuum, publicly, as a punchline at her own engagement party. I smiled. I raised my glass along with everyone else. I did not correct her, not that night. And I want to be clear that the decision not to correct her wasn't strategic in the moment, not some carefully plotted reveal I was saving for later. It was simpler than that. I genuinely didn't know, standing in that ballroom, what correcting her would have actually accomplished, beyond making an already uncomfortable family dynamic even more uncomfortable on what was supposed to be her night. I drove home after the party, made myself a cup of tea I didn't really want, and sat with the specific, familiar ache of being underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best. It wasn't new. It had simply, for one evening, become loud enough that I couldn't quite talk myself out of noticing it. 3 weeks passed in ordinary rhythm after that. I went back to running Meridian, back to board meetings and quarterly reviews, and the unglamorous daily work of overseeing a company most of my own family didn't know I owned. It was during one of those ordinary weeks, reviewing a routine compliance report flagged by our internal audit team, that Trent's name appeared in a section I genuinely wished it hadn't. Second question for you. If you found out someone in your family had been building their sense of superiority on an assumption they never bothered to check, would you have corrected it immediately, or let the truth reveal itself on its own? The report itself was straightforward, in the unglamorous way most serious workplace issues actually are, once you strip away the drama and look at the documentation. Trent had been submitting inflated mileage and expense reports for client meetings over a period of roughly 5 months, a pattern our audit software had flagged automatically once the numbers crossed a threshold that triggered manual review. It wasn't an enormous sum in absolute terms, a little over $11,000 total, but it was clear, documented, and entirely inconsistent with our expense policy. The kind of finding that, for any employee at any level, triggers a formal review process regardless of who they happen to be engaged to. I want to be completely honest about something here, because it matters to the rest of this story. I did not go looking for this. I have never once, in 4 years of running Meridian, involved myself personally in a junior employee's expense report. And I had no idea, walking into that Tuesday morning review meeting with our compliance director, that Trent's name would appear on the agenda at all. When it did, I felt something far more complicated than vindication. I felt, mostly, a kind of tired, resigned dread, because I understood immediately that whatever happened next was going to become inseparable, in my family's eyes, from a champagne toast I hadn't been able to stop thinking about for 3 weeks. Our compliance director walked me through the findings the way she would for any employee, senior or junior, family or stranger. The documentation, the pattern, the standard next steps, which included a formal meeting with HR and, depending on his response, likely termination given the clarity of the evidence. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether there was any ambiguity in the numbers, any reasonable explanation I might be missing. There wasn't. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate, submitted across too many months to be an honest mistake. I made the decision, that same week, to be present for the termination meeting myself, not out of any desire for theater, but because I genuinely believed, given the personal connection, that it was more respectful for me to handle it directly than to hide behind a title and let someone else deliver news that was, whether he knew it or not, coming from his fiance's sister. Trent walked into that conference room expecting, I think, a routine HR conversation about an expense discrepancy he likely assumed he could talk his way around. What he found instead was me, sitting at the head of the table, in a room he'd walked past 100 times, without ever once connecting to the person who actually owned the company he worked for. I watched the exact moment it landed on his face. Not the termination itself, not yet. The realization of who I actually was. If this story is hitting a nerve, subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me honestly, would you have handled the meeting personally the way I did, or stayed out of it entirely and let someone else deliver the news? I kept the meeting itself brief and entirely professional, the way I would for anyone facing the same documented evidence. I laid out the findings. I gave him the opportunity to respond, which he did, unconvincingly, with an explanation about client entertainment that didn't remotely match the specific pattern our audit had flagged. I informed him, clearly, that his employment was terminated effective immediately, with the standard severance and exit paperwork our HR team handles for every departure, regardless of circumstance. He asked me, near the end of that meeting, voice noticeably smaller than it had been at the engagement party, how long I'd owned the company. I told him the truth. 4 years. He asked if Whitney knew. I told him that was a conversation between the two of them, not something I intended to manage on his behalf. Whitney called me that same evening, already aware, having clearly heard from Trent before I'd said a single word to her myself. She was furious, initially, accusing me of engineering the entire situation as some kind of elaborate, delayed revenge for the toast. A theory that, I want to be honest, felt almost insulting in its assumption that I'd need to manufacture something when the actual documented evidence had simply, coincidentally, arrived on my desk in the ordinary course of a compliance review I had no control over the timing of. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, exactly what had happened, in the same order it had actually unfolded. The audit flag, the documentation, the termination process I'd have followed identically for any employee regardless of who they were dating. I told her I hadn't sought this out, and that I genuinely, sincerely wished it hadn't happened at all. Not because I owed Trent any particular loyalty, but because I understood exactly what it was going to cost her, 3 weeks before what should have been an uncomplicated, joyful stretch of wedding planning. She didn't believe me at first. Not entirely. It took several more conversations over the following weeks, along with, eventually, Trent's own reluctant admission to her of what the expense reports had actually shown. For the anger to shift from being aimed at me towards something closer to its actual, appropriate target. The wedding was postponed indefinitely and then, 6 months later, called off entirely for reasons that extended well beyond the expense report itself. Once Whitney started asking harder questions about several other things Trent had apparently been less than honest about throughout their relationship. I didn't take any satisfaction in that unraveling, despite everything. I genuinely have preferred, given the choice, for that engagement party toast to have simply been an unkind, forgettable joke, rather than the first thread that eventually pulled an entire relationship apart. My relationship with Whitney has slowly, carefully rebuilt itself over the past year, in ways I don't think either of us fully expected. She knows now, obviously, what I actually do, what Meridian actually is, and I think that knowledge changed something quieter in her than the simple embarrassment of the toast itself. A slow recognition that the sister she'd spent years quietly underestimating had been building something enormous the entire time, in near total silence, without ever once needing her validation to do it. So, tell me honestly, in the comments, Should I have corrected her that night at the party instead of letting the truth come out the way it did? Or did it need to happen exactly this way for either of us to actually learn anything from it? Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I still don't correct people much, even now when they assume something modest about what I do. Old habits, I suppose, or maybe just a lesson I learned a long time before that engagement party. That the truth, when it's real, tends to arrive exactly when it needs to, on its own schedule, whether anyone's ready for it or not.